van.
Oh, okay, so you put your bed inside?
Always, 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 always.
Now this is one that
Oh, that's good.
we started. She put a now with Dale.
I might actually make that one.
Right, and it makes it so much. And then of course he's left-handed, so we put it on the left-hand side so he can actually reach his neck. Yeah, that's. So, and you set the cord lock on this side.
Yeah, to draw it in.
So it stops at the zipper, does it, and then just pulls in on the one side.
Yeah.
There's problems I live in the city, so
You can trap your warm air. Different things.
With the canvas, I was wondering if you were thinking of doing that. Well, yeah, but we couldn't.
And I guess I could stop. I just had a feeling it was trouble to get into.
No.
I must go back on my USB and watch it again because I could have sworn it was like 11:40 something like when you called over.
No, it was way before that. Yeah. Way before that, yeah.
Fuck, you must have been.
It was pretty late.
Sitting there.
Yeah.
Sitting there waiting for them must have been pretty fucked up. Like every noise you hear is at them.
Oh, I know.
But you wouldn't change it for the world, surely, the experience of having done that.
No, that fucking bear never got more than 100 yards away from you at the end of it there, did he? He was on you.
Yeah. He knew that he was there. He knew you were there. He smelled. Yeah, he knew what you were.
Food.
Well, yeah, I mean, he was just mute. The bear was just waiting for when you was hungry.
Yeah. You were on his farm.
Are they conscious? Then what's the root of the you gotta keep them alive. What's the root of the problem? Then from there, call for help if you have to. If you can.
Yeah, sure. And monitor.
Yeah, then you gotta keep them alive till someone comes. Or pump them out or whatever.
That's actually part of the course. Not that we get the actual shovel, but
Never
sometimes still make it.
Okay.
4.5 hours.
The worst recovered perfect.
And oh, you got some good. What's going on here now? Looks pretty. It's a flower. There you go. So, it looks like everyone's done some work and boiled on this little problem I've given you. Can we come over to these guys maybe, and you guys can explain what it is you've come up with? All right, let's go around and. So team number
1.
I tried to say it.
All right.
So what do you got here?
So we thought we would start with survey the team, so you protect yourself.
Because it's white, sometimes you find it.
I thought it was actually way bigger.
You can get it bigger. This is as big as I've ever seen it around here, though. Yeah.
There's a thing about turkey tails. They're saying it's as good as sugar for medicinal purposes.
Certain cancers. Colon cancer especially. So yeah,
I don't do.
Just make a tea. It's got a nice mushroomy flavor. It's not something I would say, I think I'll have a tea of this.
Like I said, standard mushroom flavor.
Yeah, pretty much. Well, you smell it. You smell a bigger girlfriend.
My daughter No problem at all.
Yeah, yeah, which is nice, but it's not that nice to sit down. Yeah, exactly.
Go around and go vase shape to it.
Like trumpet?
Like a trumpet shape, yeah.
Do they turn color when they do that? Do they lighten?
No, they may lighten some. It depends on the sun. The sun will bleach them to some degree. Like you can get variations in the same species. You can get a lot of variations from small to big. But this is the classic one that you're looking for right here.
The flesh is white, and the other one, the flesh is more yellow. It can be actually hollow.
Okay, so he's trying to get a picture of this.
And if no, it's morels. I was going to say, if I'm not mistaken, the stems are solid, not hollow as well.
Is being that the substitutes are better. I've been hearing universally from hunters and anglers with the non-lead that you're getting far better projectile, far better ballistics, quicker, cleaner kills for the animals, which is what everybody wants. And again, I'm not even going to pretend to talk about this until Michael gets up, but that's been wonderful, because if I was trying to sell people to switch to something that was worse, good luck with that. We still have it being more expensive, but that is changing because, and again, Michael will address a bit of this, that
if your bullet's spinning faster than it's going forward, and it hits something and goes into a pattern like that, what happens is, as it cuts a single wound channel, it slows down dramatically. The more that bullet slows down while it's in the animal, the more energy is imparted to the animal. So these bullets are giving almost half again as much energy for the same size bullet when you're hitting your animal. Good, solid, clean kills. They're just probably the best ammo that's on the market at the present time. Everybody generally, if they hunt, wants to know one thing: can I get it for my caliber? Hornady makes it, Nosler makes it, Weatherby makes it, Barnes makes it, Remington makes it. If you want it, you can get it. And how much more does it cost? $6 to $8 a box if you're using half decent ammunition. If you're not using half decent ammunition, it's going to cost you about $15 more a box.
And that moves me into my next little sort of dig at commercialization and industry nowadays. I've got a split here, and a split is like almost like a faux leather. It's almost like one of those pressed leather belts you get at Walmart or something like that. I'm actually going to pass this around for everybody to take a look at. They're basically planing out a piece of leather to get the suede, running it through a giant printing press, and basically putting on something that appears to be top grain. If you see somebody driving a fancy car with leather interior, or you go to the furniture store and they try to sell you a $3,000 chair that's, top grain leather, chances are it's a split with a printed top grain on it. So if you want, I'll pass it around. You can actually see on the edge of the leather, there's a definite lamination of the grain and the coloration of the
times. Before you do the same thing, you have to know. And that means 110 or 150% know what you're looking at is what it is. But we have a slightly different bent. So my bent is, when I go into the woods, I prefer to make a cup of coffee. That's my first love. It's a good cup of coffee. At the same time, I like tea. But the teas I like to have in the woods usually are the wild teas. The most common wild teas people think about are things like pine needles. Great stuff, absolutely perfect stuff. By the way, we don't have any pine needles. We do have some fir tips here. And one of the reasons is pine needles are all around us. Everybody can try pine needles at some point. And I recommend, if you haven't tried pine needles, by all means do. The teas that I pick most often, excuse me, are ones that I can find any time of the year. So they're evergreen plants is what they are for the most part. They're evergreen plants. Rob has brought a few that are a summertime plant only. Good to know stuff by all means, and I'm looking forward to tasting one or two that Rob has brought as well that I haven't tried before. But we're going to look mostly at evergreen plants. One of the most favorite evergreen plants, once you go beyond the trees, is, where are we at, right here? Okay. And there's a bag, any left in the bag? Oh yeah. Okay, we'll pass the bag around as well. Is Labrador tea. Labrador tea is available all year long, as long as it's not covered in snow, that is. It's available all year long to you, and it's my personal favorite, and that's the reason why I started with Labrador tea. But I'll just give you a little brief on it. It's found in boggy areas. You're not going to find this in a dry area. You may even be standing in water when you find it. If it's not, it's probably a very wet area. But Labrador tea, and we'll show you the leaves. By all means, look at the leaves. This is not an identification course, it's more of a, yeah, so this has all been dried at home. And as far as harvesting and drying goes, you can do either way. I don't necessarily think one is better than the other. I've done both, where I've taken the branches, tied a string around it, hang it up in my basement in a dry area, wait until it's dry. And I've also taken the leaves off and put them on a dehydrator, just because you don't over dry them, because they'll go to powder if you over dry them. But you want them dry enough so that when you seal them up, they're not going to have any moisture left in them that could make them go moldy. I haven't had that experience, but there is a possibility of it.
So the drying time is going to be variable depending on the whatever you do.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, any time of year, because it's obviously going to be a little drier in the winter because of the dry air than it is in the spring when I'm walking in the bog to find it.
Yeah.
It's actually, for me, it's actually easier to find it in the winter, as long as we don't have a lot of snow, because the ground is going to be frozen enough for me to get into those boggy areas. So we have a couple poured. Anybody wants to try pot and grab? Yes, the little cups are hot. You might want to grab them.
Don't boil your water. Oh, it's always boil it if you want. If you want to make sure that it's clean water, boil it, then let it cool. Give it a minute, give it 2 minutes. Just bring it back from that boil. Not even a rolling boil, because once you do that, you scorched your teas and you lose a lot of nutrients that way.
And usually you lose medicinal value, if there is medicinal value within it. I understand that with Labrador tea, if you boil it, there's a good chance you're extracting that hallucinogenic.
Can you boil this tea? No.
Over. What else do we have here? Anybody? Yep. We also have wild lettuce. We're way past dandelion season, but we do have wild lettuce, and they're commonly confused. They're very closely related. So, plantain. Principles for identifying plantain. Now there are, we primarily find two kinds of plantain here in Nova Scotia. We have English or longleaf plantain, and most people I find aren't familiar with that one, but we also have broadleaf or plantain, which is the one most everybody knows. This is not the best sample. If we come across some better samples, I'll pull some up for you at that time. We have this stuff grows at our house. You know, it's huge. The ground is very fertile because we raise gardens and grow most of our own food at our homestead, and we get these leaves getting this big around. Plantain is a relatively easy plant to identify. It's a monocot, very simple growth development, large simple vein structure in the leaves, and the leaves are rounded, sometimes oval, sometimes they come to a slight point like you might be able to make out here. A distinctive feature when it becomes mature is you'll see these veins coming out of the leaf structure. These veins are quite tough, and they're not really digestible, but the plantain itself is always digestible. If it has become older and veiny, you can still get that green part between the veins. By the way, I never recommend to anybody that they use anything for medicine or food that I don't eat myself. So, unlike some field guides you're going to see, if I've recommended to you, I've used it. Plantain, when it's young and tender, can be used in salads. It's also an excellent green for cooking or putting in stews and such. It's a very versatile plant, and it has a mild flavor. It's pretty much always good. But one of my favorite uses for plantain is not actually the leaves. It's the seed stalks. These are incredibly small seed stalks, but it's the seed stalks. And places where plantain grows better, you'll sometimes see these stalks getting this big, and they're covered with these tiny seeds on them. The seeds get bigger on the big plantains as well. The way you harvest these seeds is you grab it, pinch it from the end, and pinch backward like this into your hand. And you'll get the seeds off. On the thicker stems, these stems are much tougher, and so they hang in there better. These are kind of like flax. I like to put them in oatmeal. In fact, I have some oatmeal salt pre-mixed, so I can just heat it up for breakfast or whenever when I want it. And I always put a lot of this stuff in my oatmeal. It's really good for you.
Is there a point where you get a ripeness or anything, or just as soon as they appear?
Always good. It's never a bad time for plantain. It's always good. I'll use them when they're brown. I'll just rub them between my hands and get the stuff off the outside.
This is the important thing.
Yeah, a little bit nutty. Kind of like unripe lettuce. Plantain has another very important medicine.
As long as the rain stays away.
We'll get back to
that. Yeah.
Right now it doesn't matter. It's pretty much done anyway. Can be. Yep, and it's good for
Can we have a look inside?
And have a lot of
Look at that. It's not burnt. It's just smoked. Just smoked. Wow. And the meat's still all white, kind of in a pinkish because of the smoke, so it's real good.
Okay, you clear off and just leave me here.
I'll get you some after. I'll take the 2 chickens with me.
neurotoxin that makes water hemlock and poison hemlock so deadly, and it will absorb through your skin. It is a very serious neurotoxin. It doesn't take much. Like one of those roots could probably kill 10 cattle. One of those little roots. Extremely toxic. But the other reason I'm bringing you over here. Try it. Yeah. I like the rough papers now. Yeah, thanks. Oh, you're gonna have to dig at that one. Anybody know this plant? Coltsfoot, exactly. What's coltsfoot good for? Anybody know? Magnesium, yeah. But what are its uses? Anybody know its uses? It's not toxic and it can be used when it's young and tender. You can cook it, throw it in a stew or whatnot. It's not a great plant. On a scale of 1 to 10 taste-wise, I'd call this a 1.5. It's something you use if you need food. It will not give you much in the way of calories, but it will give you nutrition. An old use for coltsfoot that is true if the ground has any sodium chloride or salt in it. Coltsfoot is a salt sponge. It loves salt and it soaks in salt. So in the old days, and the pioneers would come through, and I've heard the Aboriginals have done it too, I don't know for sure, but they would collect coltsfoot and then they burn it to ash, and you can put the ash in your food, and there's your salt. It's a way to get salt away from the sea. Now, let's find out if this stuff is salty or not, because you can taste it right on the leaf if it is. Well, it's salt. For example, if you put down furs, it'll keep sticks away. Is that true? I think that's a myth. The only thing I know of that really... That's not what I wanted to hear. Okay.
All those years of using fur.
I know. What you could do to get ticks out of there is you could make a bed of fire, get it real hot, let it turn into coal, lay it over with a thin bit of ground, then put your bedding over it and smoke it. But the only thing I know that effectively keeps ticks away is DEET, and I forget the active ingredient for this stuff I'm carrying in my vest. Poisonous hemlocks have smooth stems. Also, the poisonous hemlocks, unless it gets washed off by a heavy rain, have a whitish powder on the outside of the stem. 3, and very importantly, perhaps the most important identification trait, you're going to see that the wild carrot inside the stem, it is solid with a white pith. It is not hollow. And the poison hemlocks are always hollow.
Okay.
I make peanut bread once. I put little balloons in the oven.
If you just want to make a rough spoon, or if you want to see if you can do it and make it smooth, just use your knife tip. And what you'd end up doing, and I'll demonstrate this, you'd go into your bowl and you start to take little bits out. I'm sorry about the mess I'm about to make, everyone. We'll have cinders for later. Here you go. All you do. Pardon?
Try that again. Hurry up.
Got that broad shoulder.
Feel the love.
Which campsite?
I don't camp here. Shoot. Yeah. I just come for the day.
They just leave rope for defense.
No, I'm not.
I people walk into things.
They let you out on weekends.
Yeah, I got my pass in my pocket.
I missed the orange suit, you must have changed.
It was striped.
You're getting all this?
Okay,
It was
crazy
actually a
Nova
Hungry
Scotian.
jacket.
He's holding a sharp knife, don't make him laugh.
This one's not waiting for throwing, no. Alright, so thank you, Wayne. Was that Wayne who said that? Yeah, don't make me laugh while I'm doing this, please.
In a bad spot.
Should have put the Kevlar glove on.
Yeah. I'm gonna get a better one of those actually. So what we do is you put it in, you can twist, you can take little parts off. Actually, Mark goes into a lot of detail on that, but a little bit more than what I could go into with the amount of time I think I have.
The only thing I'd say, the only thing I'd say, be careful of it, is don't hold it in your palm. There's a real tendency to hold it in your palm.
Yeah.
Oh,
So doing this, and with a knife like that, that's not a great idea, because if it, as you can imagine, that could just go, and if you're not wearing some form of protective glove, that's just gonna get messy. And the reason why I'm doing it like this, just take a second and imagine how long it would take to take all this wood down with just your knife. You can do it. You'll be very patient. I've done it. I've actually taken a piece like this and turned it into one of those. But I quite prefer, if I have the time, to go out in the daylight, important to do that in the daylight, and trim it down with my hatchet. And what I'll do is I'll kind of guesstimate how deep of a bowl I want, so I can even take my hatchet and just trim down a little bit. And what I'm looking for, I think I had another one over here. I'm looking for something even more trimmed down than this. So this is just kind of an example I did quickly yesterday morning. A little more trimmed down than this. This looks very rough, I realize. Oh, here we go. Something more like that. I trimmed that down almost to that with a hatchet.
Can you see that?
When you're doing this, there's something that's known as a stop cut. And what a stop cut is we bring our hatchet down, or if you're batoning with a knife, and what we do is you can take a little saw, or you can take your knife, you can take your hatchet, and you make a gouge into there. So you gouge it into there, and then you take your axe. Now, of course, you wouldn't do this with your fingers right there, but just for demonstration, I'm going to have to hold it. And you'd want to trim down and go to there, and then you knock the whole side off. There's a bit of an issue with that. Most of the time, once you get the hang of it, it'll work fine. The issue is that if you got a heavier hatchet, or you're just not being careful, or it just is going to slip, what you're going to end up doing is you're going to end up cutting off half your bowl. Just be aware that when you have a roughly made spoon, one thing that I'd only be a little bit cautious about, or quite cautious about, splinters. You don't want splinters coming out with your stew, because you're not going to notice it depending on what you're eating. So you want to make sure that that's nice, or else you're...
And a lot of practice. And yes, the first knife that you're going to try and sharpen is going to be a lot more duller than it was when you started. Okay? There's many skilled sharpeners. So what I'm going to show you is what I do, the stuff I use, what I prefer, but it doesn't mean that you have to go that way, because there's many techniques, there's many ways of doing it. But one thing you have to remember, if you remember anything from this demo, is angle. Okay? This has to be perfect. Everybody knows what this is? Yes. Okay, it's the bevel of your knife, or the apex. There's all kinds of names for it, but this has to be exactly perfect if you want your knife to be sharp. If one side is this way, the other one, it's not going to work, right? I know Sam mentioned it already. I'm going to put this right away in here. We often hear that a sharp knife is a what?
Dangerous knife.
Safe knife.
Or all the way around, sorry.
A sharp knife is a safe knife. Why? Randall, you're not allowed to answer anything.
It's less likely to slip.
You're exerting less energy to make the cut.
That's good. I'm looking for one word, though.
It's
Respect.
one.
No.
Slip.
Control?
Control.
See, I'm good already.
A control knife is a safe knife, and a safe control knife is a sharp knife. Now that doesn't mean you'll never cut yourself. You'll still cut yourself, but the risks maybe are 70%. Well,
Am I still not allowed to say anything?
It could also be a clean cut as opposed to a rip.
yeah, exactly. You can go ahead, Randy. That's what I'm going to say. No problem. Okay, so I'm going to basically start what I use at home, and then we're going to go through some quick stuff for the field. I prefer what they call Japanese water stones. Okay, I've got one side here that's 1,000 grit, and the other side is 6,000 grit. Now these need to soak for a little while, like 5-10 minutes. Why I prefer water stones? Now I have nothing against other stones with oil, you know, but I rather play with water, and water is readily available anywhere. It's not as messy for the hands. Also, when you do sharpen with these, they tend to take less metal off